Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
You are watching Conversations with Jennylyn, and as I continue my COVID-19 World Interview Series, today I have the honor for a second time on my show to interview Mr. Tony Powell, and he is a famous historian. And I am so happy to spend time with him once more. Tony, welcome to Conversations with Jennylyn.
Thank you so much for having me back on your show.
Well, since I've interviewed you to date, so much is going on in the world. So I know we have a lot to talk about. I heard that
absolutely.
Since COVID-19, you have published some books.
I have. Since the pandemic started, I realized my mortality. And so I had to finish up some issues with my life's work. And those issues were me publishing my life's work. So I've done a 4-volume series under Portraits in Black, called For the Love of Liberty, the African American Soldier. And then I indulged in 4 other volumes that deal with the African American soldier as a chaplain, the African American soldier as an athlete. And then my last 2 deal with the personal recollections of African American soldiers that served between the 1890s and the outbreak of World War II. And I did one other, which is the story of the greatest World War I band leader of all time, James Reese Europe. And it's a story of his life by Noble Sissel, who was his drum major and his assistant bandmaster.
So clearly, some of these books are about you.
About my research and work.
I see.
Of what I've done over the past 50 years.
So have you been a military athlete?
I was never an athlete. I was never a jock. I just had a brain.
I see.
I can tell their stories.
That's what motivated this?
What motivated me was my grandfather, who had served in the military for 40 years, beginning in 1887, retiring in 1927.
Wow.
And his life was unique. He lived to be 105. He died in 1979. But his military career spanned the advent of the airplane, the rocket. He was able to see men landing on the moon.
Wow.
And all of this during his lifetime. So he was the impetus that got me started in wanting to tell his story. And so what I did with that was I did a traveling exposition based on his photography that was seen by over 1 million Americans for 13 years. And it traveled crisscross the country, the South, the West, the North, the Midwest. And it, for the first time, gave my grandfather the acknowledgement for his photography taken at a time when there weren't too many Blacks that were into photography.
Wow, so this is a story worth telling. You would have been remiss if you hadn't done this.
Oh, absolutely, because I was partially raised by my grandparents. And, my grandmother and grandfather were a unique couple. My grandfather was an African American, and my grandmother, her and her family immigrated from Germany. They were Jewish in 1890 to Brooklyn. And they met during the so-called Spanish-American War. She fell in love with him, that old black magic. And they were married for over 70 years.
Oh my goodness. I could imagine back then that must have been quite the story too.
Yes, it was. Her family disowned her.
A German and a Black man?
That's right.
Tell us, how did her family react to that union?
They disowned her. But that was typical of that era of
Right. Exactly.
But you know, there's an old saying, you can't stop love.
You can't. You can't turn it off.
You can't turn it off. And so for 70 years, they loved.
And they lived it throughout. They lived their lives together.
They lived their lives together over the United States. They couldn't serve any place in the American South because she was white and he was black. So, you know, they were, you know, able to go every place else, you know, during their long marriage.
Boy, that's a book by itself.
It is.
A German marrying a black man back then. A
Back
soldier
then.
nonetheless.
And it was not an uncommon thing for soldiers, period, to marry people of the places that they were at.
Of course.
I'll give you an example. In the American West, black soldiers married Native Americans. Whites married Native Americans. When the American Army invaded the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, black soldiers married Filipinas. Okay? And so it was something that was done pretty much by any army throughout history. You know, this has happened.
And they have such beautiful offsprings.
Because that is something that most people don't realize. I think genetically we were made to reproduce. And we reproduce beautiful children when they come from the human race that are of a variety of different humans.
Exactly.
They come out looking absolutely wonderful.
Yes,
But
cute.
still human. You know, that's the key there, still human. You know, it's almost like COVID, you know, 19. You know, people think that because they may be rich, because they may be young, they will not be affected by COVID-19. But the reality is it makes no difference who you are. If you don't take the precautions, you will be affected by COVID-19.
Yes.
And so I think for Americans, that's something that's very important for them to know. They don't realize that over 1 million Americans have already been affected by it, and over 100,000 have died.
Right.
And we haven't hit the spike yet. You know, so I just feel that we can't let our guards down too soon. Otherwise, it may turn into a second Spanish influenza that killed off a good segment of humanity, 1918, 1919, and 1920.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't get there, that people will take it seriously and learn from what's happening. Just pay attention. I think part of the problem is people do not trust the regular news channels. They think everything is sensationalized and that the news is sensationalizing what's really happening, which is why I did this show. And I've been speaking to people in different parts of the world, and it's the same story. You have to take it seriously. I'm going to come back to COVID-19, but Tony, these books, I mean, I'm intrigued. So your grandfather was a military personnel. And
he was an enlisted soldier that joined the Army at the age of 13 in 1887. And when he first joined the Army, my grandfather was a typical, totally illiterate country boy, black, from Tennessee. The Army did something for him that outside of that structure was hard for Americans to do. The Army educated him. It was compulsory for white, black, any enlisted man that did not have the rudiments of an education. They had no choice but to go to school on post. If you had known my grandfather, you would have thought he had at least the master's degree. He was that well read. So the Army gave him some very things that he kept his whole life. And then the other thing that it gave him that was very important was an 8-to-5, a career that spanned 40 years, a career that gave him the opportunity of advancement that outside of the military structure in American civilian society was almost impossible for a black man to do.
Amazing. Now you talk about his photography. Where can people, is it accessible to the public? And if it is, where is it?
Okay, it is accessible to the public. Of the 4 volumes that I've just released, the majority of the images are portraits and images that my grandfather took between 1887 and the end of World War I. So quite a few of the photography, and I have, in my collection of his things, all of the images.
That must be phenomenal. I'd love to see them.
Well, the old cliche, a picture is worth 1,000 words. When you look at these pictures of African American soldiers, you don't see the typical African American that was portrayed by the media of that day. Something like, a comic character, but what you see is a dignified, honorable man who was proud of who he was. Over the course of my 50 years of research, I interviewed my grandfather and several of his contemporaries, and I always asked the question, why did you join the Army? And I asked my grandfather that in the late 50s, I said, why did you join this racist country's army, as bad as they treat us? And he told me something that took me a while to understand. He said the Army gave him the only part of the American dream that the nation would let him share. So he regretted not 1 second of his 40 years in the Army. Now, it took me a time to say, God, Granddad sounds like an Uncle Tom. But in reality, he was not. He was a product of his generation that took whatever he could take to improve the lives of himself and his descendants that would follow after him.
Amazing. I could go on and make this entire interview about your grandfather because it's so fascinating.
And then I would have pictures to show you of all of the...
Do you have any with you? Can you show us anything?
I do, as a matter of fact. I do.
Talk about some of it.
Some of the images that I guess, I don't know how we would do this in the sun. Okay, can you see?
Yeah, I can, but oh, wow.
Let me see if I can.
It's gonna be difficult, I think. Maybe what you can do.
Can you see that a little bit?
I can. Which one is your grandfather?
My grandfather's not in this one.
Okay.
This is a picture that he took of fellow soldiers of his in the 24th Infantry. These were the senior NCOs of the regiment.
And what year was that?
This was 1909 at Madison Barracks in New York.
They look so proud.
And that's exactly what they were. They were dignified, honorable, proud soldiers who were never ashamed of being African Americans.
Wow. Now, can you show me the cover of the book that has those pictures in them?
The cover of the book is volume 1 from my series, and you see a picture of Eric's son's lookalike.
Yes.
And that's on the cover of volume 1 that takes in the period 1866 to 1897. And
so you have these volumes available on Amazon. Where can people buy them?
They can buy them on Amazon 2 ways. I have paperback and I've done the Kindle versions.
We're not seeing your face anymore.
Okay, so
there you go.
I have done the volumes in both Kindle format, okay, where you just put it download it to your computer, and I've done the printed versions for those that like a book to flip the pages. Yeah, and they are available. 13 volumes are available now on Amazon.com.
Okay, so people I am going to check it out. I find it very fascinating.
Yeah, and it's, because what you see are images of my grandfather's generation that made the lie of what the public tried to portray them as. And you see these handsome, dignified men who served this country, and we have to admit that it was our great grandparents that built this country. You know, they were the ones, it was their slave labor that built what America is. And so does that suggest that people did not come here before, you know? And I did a study of America before the Europeans. And the interesting thing is that there were 125 million Native Americans who lived between Canada and South America.
Wow.
When Columbus came, he found a population that was dense. And these people weren't hunter-gatherers. These people lived in cities made of stone. They had pyramids that they built. But when the Spanish came, they did something very clandestine. The Spanish and Portuguese did not bring settlers to the Americas. They brought priests, they brought soldiers, and they brought administrators. So 400 years after the fact, most people from Mexico South think that they're Latino, think that they have some Spanish blood. But the reality is that 89% of their DNA is Native American. And if you look at the hieroglyphics, you know, on the pyramids, and you look at the people of Mexico, those are the same people, because the Spanish did not bring people here. Okay? Whereas in North America, it was different. The Brits, the Germans, the Dutch brought people to colonize this land. And with it, it made it almost impossible for those people that met them and fed them during that so-called first Thanksgiving. It made it impossible for them to continue to live. The land was stolen. Within 100 years, there were no Native Americans who were not blended that lived east of the Mississippi. And until this day, there are none. They are gone. Those that lived in the southern states, the so-called other civilized Native Americans, in 1837, President Andrew Jackson had them physically removed to the Indian Territory. And these Native Americans dressed like white people, they farmed like white people, they owned slaves like white people. But they were forced to leave their land, and their land was confiscated by Americans, you know, the whites that came after. The only Indians that put up a real fight were those that lived west of the Mississippi. Okay, and these Indians were still indeed hunter-gatherers. Okay, they lived in teepees, whereas the Native Americans in the East, they lived in houses, they farmed the land, they lived in towns. These people were hunter-gatherers and they followed the herds. But when the Spanish came, they brought the horse. Some got away because there were no horses in America.
Right.
Some got away, and those southern Indians, you know, in Arizona and all those places caught these animals, and they became fierce horse warriors, and they fought the invaders back. And it took until the late 1890s before all of these tribes were forced on reservations, but they live to this day. Not like the Eastern Indians that are gone. Those west of the Mississippi are still around. Their land is gone, but the people are still here.
Very fascinating.
And I know I talk a lot. Sorry about that.
No, but that's why you're here, is to share this stuff with me. Now, how many children did your grandparents have?
They had 4 boys and 4 girls. So there were 8.
Wow, this German lady did well.
She did well. She did very well. You know, just as a side thought, you know, when my grandfather retired in 27, in 1920 in Los Angeles, they decided that was going to be their home.
Mm-hmm.
So he was still away at Fort Huachuca, and my grandmother bought the home. And when he finally came home after retirement, her neighbors sued her because she never told them that she was married to a black man.
Are you serious?
But if they would have opened their eyes, they could have saw these mulatto children. That's, yeah.
That is funny.
And they took her to court, and she won her day in court.
You mean they sued her because
Oh, they sued her
her
because,
grandfather?
yeah, because they did not allow Black people to live in the neighborhood where she bought the home.
What year was this?
1920. So between 1920 and 27. Yes. Oh, those laws lasted until the 1970s.
This is so amazingly fascinating. So tell me, what happened with the lawsuit? Did they?
She won. She won.
She won.
She won, and they lived in that house until they died.
Good for her.
Oh, yeah.
So in light of what's happening in the world right now, how is all of this making you feel based on your solid historical background?
You know, what people need to understand is that we are all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Forget politics. As far as I'm concerned, the Democrats, the Republicans are supposed to do our business, but they are so polarized with, you know, with their own inner fightings that they don't do our business.
Mm-hmm.
But if people understand just that simple thing, that there's only one race, it's the human race. And we are all part of it. I mean, Black Lives Matter has really been going on, and that's a great thing. Because since we are all the same, there should not be one portion of the human race that is not treated as equal as all the rest of the human race. And so, you know, that's a good thing. Because in my time, they would have came with clubs and tanks and everything else, you know, to end that. Yeah, so I think the younger generation, my grandchildren's generation, are a generation that there's some prejudice, but I think they look more at people based on their character than based on pigmentation. Most of the young people think a schmuck is a schmuck, no matter what color he is or she is. Yeah.
And that's the way it should be. We shouldn't be separated based on the tones in our skin.
Not at all. Not at
Because
all. It has to be based on the character of our nature.
mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned before, when a human baby is born, it is a pure vessel. It has no anger, no greed, no jealousy. All of those are learned things that they learn from their family and their immediate community. So if we can just clone that baby before it gets 5 years old, it would be a wonderful world.
Do you think that we will ever see that change in this world?
I may not see it in my lifetime, but I think that the younger generation we have today can change it. When I look at the people that are protesting, I don't just see Black people. I see young people of our whole span of humanity out there protesting, all types. Now, you know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, you more than likely only see Blacks protesting, a few Jewish people that always supported those protesters out there. Okay, but today you see young people of all ethnic backgrounds saying that this is wrong.
Well, I interviewed a doctor in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and he told me they were being told that the whites were superior to the Black people. And he said, ironically, in the medical school that he attended, when they did their labs, they were actually using the bodies of Black. They were using Black bodies parts.
Black cadavers.
To their studies, right? And
Yep.
And he just thought that was so, you know, silly, and it is silly.
And you know, when you really look at it and you think about it, it is a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're going to have people, humans of our race, irregardless of the yellow, pink, blue, or green. You're going to have some that are good, some that are bad, some that are indifferent. It is just the way of our makeup. But can the younger generation change that? I think they can. But I think because we are Homo sapiens, we're going to always have a few problems with some people that, want to be different.
Well, and there are people that are angry. And for whatever reason, wherever their anger is coming from, they take it out on the people they deem vulnerable or less than them. And so I think because we'll always have angry people, we may always have problems like what we're seeing today.
But I think, though, if people look in the mirror, if they stop blaming some outside source for their discomfort, there's the solution. When we as humans can take responsibility for our actions, it can change the whole dichotomy of what's going on. And that's not brain surgery. You don't have to be a surgeon to do it. It can happen to any human. It's just the mirror. What did Michael Jackson say?
I was gonna say,
Yeah. That man or that woman in the mirror.
Exactly.
And that is where the buck stops, right there.
Exactly. So Tony, we are experiencing a pandemic right now, as I'm sure everybody knows. How has that affected Tony's life?
Well, for the first couple of months, it affected my life by thinking that, God, I'm human and I may die. And I've got some things that I need to finish. So for the last 3 months, I finished my volumes. I've continued my research. We're getting ready to do a documentary. As a matter of fact, we're going to do some of the shooting here at Eric's place. Couple of weeks, I think it is, in a couple of weeks. And so those are the things that Tony has been doing. That if I am going to go and leave this earth, I want to make sure that my research is there for people to learn by. And I would never suggest to you that I think I'm going to go to heaven and flap all over God's heaven. That's just not me. I think that life is a cycle. Birth, growing up, growing old, sickness, and death. So how are we immortalized? We're immortalized by our prodigy that carry our DNA, that remember us. That's how we continue to live on.
Yes, and you have to leave a story for your grandson to tell, like you were telling your grandfather's story.
Oh, absolutely.
And I can tell you've already left him a lot of material.
Why, thank you so much. But that material is left to the world. For those that have an interest in true history that is not biased, it goes to the world. For them to learn that, all of we humans, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the color, we're all the same. We do great things. We do mediocre things. We do bad things.
I want to ask you this question because of what's happening in the world now and all the Black Lives Matter. When your grandfather and his wife, your grandparents, moved into that neighborhood and they were sued and they tried to get them evicted and they lost and they continued to live there, what was their lifestyle like? Did people eventually embrace and make them a part of the neighborhood? Do you know?
Yes, they did. And like with everything else in America, the neighborhood that they first lived in eventually became a Black neighborhood. Okay.
So your grandmother, who's white, set a tone for Black people in a white neighborhood.
That's right. Yeah. And in America, we've had this thing called white flight. When people of color move in, they start moving out. But the world has gotten so small, they can't do that anymore. And, we have rich people, poor people, whatever, can live any place.
Where is that house now?
That house is on Morgan Avenue, right off of Vernon, in South Central LA.
And is it still owned by the family?
It is not.
Okay.
When my grandmother died and my grandfather went into the senior center, my uncle sold the place.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you go to Los Angeles, out of curiosity, do you drive by to look at it?
All the time. All the time.
Lots of changes, or does it still hold a lot of memories from the outside?
The changes are that the neighborhood has changed again. I mean, at one time it was predominantly white, then it became predominantly black, now it's predominantly Hispanic.
Is that something? The evolution of the neighborhood.
And that's just the way things are. Yeah.
And so, Tony, what is the one thing you can say, because you've learned many things from your grandfather, clearly. Clearly, you're very proud of his work, the person he was, and his amazing photography. I think for back then, that's amazing photography. What is the one thing you think that sticks out in your mind about your grandfather?
What sticks out in my mind about him was the fact that being raised in Tennessee as an illiterate person, to go into the Army, talk his way into the military service at 13, and to have a life that was beneficial, not just for himself, but for his family that came later. And I think back to the time when I thought he was an Uncle Tom, because he said the Army gave him the only part of the American dream that the nation would let him live in. It took years before I could appreciate what the old man meant. And so I think what he left to us was a legacy of, if you have the determination to do something, you can do it. And my grandfather was never a religious person. He was very agnostic. You know, he believed that predestiny was the thing. And I think that, you know, he lived his life pretty much the way he lived. Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time. What haven't I asked you that you'd like to leave with the viewers?
Well, what I would leave with your viewers is just a simple thing. In order to be happy, we have to look into the mirror. The only one that can change us is us. It's not an easy thing to do, but it can be done. And I would tell them to look around people that they see that are happy people. Start emulating it. Ask them the question, why are you so happy and smiling and all of this? And learn what the formula is, because it's a formula that is something that we can all use.
Great wisdom. So what have you learned about you during this coronavirus before we go? I like to ask everybody this question.
Well, I've learned about me that if time comes where my beautiful wife has to lay me to rest, do it like the old Romans, burn me and throw my ashes to the wind. But I think she's going to have to wait a while, because I got another 40 years to go.
I agree with you. Your grandfather lived to 105.
And I got 140 to go.
That's what I'm saying. Well, Tony, this was just a privilege to spend this time with you, hearing about your grandfather and the history. I will definitely go check out those books, because I am very fascinated with, you know, that era. And when I hear, you know, a guy could join the Army at 13 years old and make such a success of his life through the Army, I realized that it's all about our attitude in almost everything that we do.
I agree, absolutely.
Life throws us a lot of opportunities, and it's what we do with them that will really matter in the end.
Yes. And I thank you very much for having me on board. I mean, I'm ready anytime if you just want to look at some photographs.
Oh, before I go, can you just say again where people can access those photos?
Yes, the audience can access the photos by going to Amazon.com, author Anthony Powell, and they can purchase my books or the Kindle versions of the book and enjoy them and share them.
Tony, once again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy Saturday to do this interview. I'm very grateful, and I can't wait to share this footage with people. And thank you so much for watching Conversations with Jennylyn. When a conversation is all you need to be inspired, like this amazing history lesson we just shared with Tony. And once again, Tony, thank you, and I will see you next time.